Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Beyond Talking Points with Matt and Matt. Today we have a bit of a different episode than usual. Usually we have like one or two topics that we both feel pretty strongly about, or at least we have some thoughts on, and then we just kind of discuss them for like half an hour or so. Today's going to be slightly different. There will still be a discussion, of course, but my friend here has been listening to a lot of news in the past 8 months or so, and he has a lot of thoughts about coronavirus, and involving policy and how we should be dealing with these kinds of things, and what that means for our relationship with government. Um, so I am sort of here as the devil's advocate. I mean, I might disagree with most of what he says, but I'm not here to present my case as thoroughly as he is. We will do a second episode where I present my case as thoroughly as he will do in this episode. But for the most part, I don't have any notes. I'm going in relatively ignorant. I'm just kind of going to be here to listen to what he says and maybe offer counterpoints or just have him clarify more. And yes, it might be a little longer of an episode than usual, but we think it'll be fun. So Matt, take it away.
Yeah, and before I kind of jump into before I jump into like the thesis I have here of my thoughts on the coronavirus and the government's response to it, I also want to say, normally we don't really research things. And we normally talk a lot from like, I guess, our background of just knowing about things. Like when we talk about Jordan Peterson, we'll watch the hour lecture, but we don't then like follow up on all the things they cite. Now, this has pretty much been, I listen to a stupid amount of news because I have a desk job that allows me to sit there with my headphones in and just burn through stuff. And I've just picked up things that I find important, and sometimes I feel like it's overlooked and people aren't thinking critically about it correctly. So this is my conclusion. I will say, we don't super heavily edit this podcast, which you probably know if you are a regular listener. So there might be times where I'm actually like shuffling through papers or grabbing my phone to try to cite something better. So bear with me a little bit because we haven't done that many heavily researched episodes. So I just wanted to say that from the start. But to dive in, I guess the basic thesis that I have here is that in general, in terms of the coronavirus, the government should be taking no action that is expanding government in order to combat the epidemic we're facing. And a few of the main general lines of thought I'm going to be pursuing are, or reasons for this, is because it is unclear if the coronavirus is quote unquote defeatable. And it's unclear if unilateral lockdown policies are sustainable. Also, that policies need to look at several variables as opposed to only thinking about minimizing coronavirus cases. And then we may be using, in general, invalid metrics to either be measuring coronavirus or looking at the significance of events that are occurring. I think that's kind of to be one of the most extensive fields of thought, is looking at a lot of things that are cited and why and which things we should actually be looking at or what matters. And then I would come to the conclusion that informed consent, when people take action in their own right, is really the most effective plan, especially with something as complex as coronavirus that affects people in tons of different ways. You really do have to leave it to the people's hands because all the policies we have are far too blunt for what we understand. So that's the big starting point. I think if we want to start in one of the subtopics, maybe we'll start smaller. And maybe in a more, I guess, in my mind, factual way of looking, a more factual, not as opinion-based. And I think that's talking about if the coronavirus could even hypothetically be like, quote unquote, defeatable. Do you think that's an okay place to start? Okay. So as we've, known about this virus for about 8 months at this point, from the beginning, the policy that was put into place was this 2-week lockdown period that ended up lasting longer, shorter in different places, and such, that it devolved into local policies in different states and regions. But I actually kind of question if the coronavirus could even hypothetically be defeated. So a lot of recent information that points in that direction that we couldn't simply, like, I guess, eradicate it is when we've looked at a lot of the vaccine trials that have been occurring and how there's this idea that there could be a vaccine for coronavirus, but there's also the idea that the vaccine would have to be like a flu shot where you have to get one every year, because the coronavirus is actually something that you would not necessarily get immunity to. There was recently a study that came out this last week, and it came over from, I want to say, the UK, somewhere in Europe at the least, in that vicinity. And they pretty much tested the antibody count in people who had coronavirus. And they found that over a span of time, like a few months from when they initially got it, and then were tested again a few months later, their antibodies had been reduced. So we're actually not sure about the long-term immunity people will get from coronavirus, from having it, like how long they'll be immune. And we're not really sure if vaccines will be things that have to keep being re-upped every certain amount of time, or if it's really just you mostly get it once and then you're good. And then the few times it's been documented that somebody already has had coronavirus twice, it's because the first time they were asymptomatic. So they tested positive for whatever reason they were tested, even though they had no symptoms, and they tested positive, but they didn't have any symptoms, but then they were able to actually get it again later. And the thinking there is when you don't have symptoms, your body doesn't create as many antibodies. So maybe your natural defense isn't immune to the coronavirus for very long. So one of the reasons I bring all this up is because when we talk about a lockdown, I think it's pretty clear that even if you have a strict lockdown and you did it for even, say, a month, the disease wouldn't be gone from the world, even if you lock down everything for a month. That's not how any disease in human history has worked. We can eradicate things by having very, very effective vaccines, and then those diseases are slow to mutate. But if you lock everybody in their house for 3 weeks, transmission will drastically be reduced, but it won't go away. It will still be out there. And if you have something that's fairly contagious, whenever you reopen again, the numbers of people who get it and are transmitting it will increase, because that's the whole one-to-one. The transmission variable is like greater than 1-to-1. If you have it, you're on average going to give it to like 1.5 people. So the lockdown, since it won't eradicate it, the number will just continue to grow again. So I guess what I'm trying to lay out is we can't simply defeat it by waiting it out for a vaccine, or we don't know we can defeat it by waiting out for a vaccine. And if you lock down and you don't eradicate it, it's going to start going around again. So lockdowns aren't necessarily a great policy because they're not very sustainable. And it's not even clear that if we locked down until a vaccine came out, that would even be a great plan, because we don't know how effective those things will be. And the disease won't just go away just because we reduce transmission by a lot. It will just pick up again whenever we unlock down. So that's my first broad thought. So you can jump in a little bit and let me know what you're thinking.
I guess the first thing that comes to my mind has to do with the fallibility of medicine and of doctors. Doctors are not perfect, and the profession they practice is not perfect. Neither are just scientists in general, and researchers and virologists. And so I think I don't mean to. Well, I don't want to try to get. I don't want to go down a media rabbit hole, but I'm just going to say something to connect it to a broader point. But I get the sense that when one study comes out by a group of researchers, the media is quick to grab that study and report on it. But I think we need to realize that that's not how the scientific method works. There have been, even professionals have given conflicting or confusing information about the whole pandemic. And I think part of that has to do with media sensationalizing certain things, or part of it just has to do with that there are a lot of unknowns when it comes to the coronavirus, and we need to be clear that these unknowns exist, and that no action we take is guaranteed to work completely or work flawlessly. The other thing that came to my mind, and I wish I had like the countries written down or something. I think one of them might be New Zealand, but there do appear to have been a couple countries where they locked down for a certain period of time, and they either reduced the reduced the amount of COVID cases drastically, or in a few places got rid of it completely. So what do you what would you say to someone who might say, well, on the news I heard that this country got rid of COVID completely, and they did it by shutting down for 2 months. You can comment also on the other point about how the scientific method and medicine and whatnot isn't perfect, but yeah.
So quick thoughts on, I guess, the part about the media and how they interpret science. I definitely agree that a lot of studies, like you'll take one study and it won't be replicated, and it's just like, oh, they found this, and that'll be pumped into the news as if that's now fact. And it's like, well, obviously we haven't had a month to digest it. This came out in the last week. But there's a lot that's pointing to like how coronavirus, it seems to be constantly evolving, how there looks like there's a strain that was more prevalent in the United States and Europe versus the one that was more likely in China, and how one strain was more deadly than the others. And a lot of that is also what kind of leads into why I don't think it can be defeated, because it seems like most evidence points to the disease the coronavirus can evolve to some extent. So what makes us think that this type of illness could be treated and eradicated like we could with smallpox when we still have, the flu? So is it closer to being something that can evolve like the flu, or is it closer to something that just won't evolve and you give your kids it once and then they won't get it? And it seems more likely that it's going to be a long-term fixture. So then to talk about, so like countries that lock down and now they're not seeing huge amounts of coronavirus. So I guess I would say a lot of those countries are very small countries, and it seems that they didn't have a large amount of coronavirus cases by the time they were on alert. This gets kind of tricky when you talk about the United States, because there are a lot of experts who think coronavirus was in the United States a lot longer before we started reporting it. Because there are people who think in certain South American countries that they had things that lined up with coronavirus months ago, like months before our lockdowns, like late 2019. And there are people who speculate that, gosh, I wish I remembered this off the top of my head. I didn't think it would come up, but it was a state like West Virginia had very, very, very low cases at first. And it's because the people who worked in the hospital systems there were saying that there were very high cases of what seems to now be coronavirus there, like 4 months before it was even really on our radar. So I guess I would say a lot of these countries that are like small Nordic countries, it doesn't appear that they had a population that was large. So they were able to lock down and they were able to quarantine specific people. And then they were kind of able to stunt it. And they also like haven't reopened for immigration. And they've still kept pretty strict rules, relatively speaking. I mean, you see some videos where some places are pretty open, but it seems like they were fairly strictly locked down for a while. And it's not like they're being very, very, very strict about who they let in the country. So it's kind of like, is that sustainable for, the rest of existence to keep their population ever away from this disease?
So could I jump in here with one quick question?
Yeah.
I just want a point of clarification. So is your criticism of the how the effectiveness of the lockdown, is that dependent then on the fact that the U.S. is just such a large country?
Well, so the other point I'd make about that small country where like nobody's gotten it. So in the end goal, what you want is people to have antibodies to the disease, and preferably in the ideal universe, we'd want to get there without people actually having to get the disease, because it's not good if people get a disease if they don't have to. So if you think about these Nordic countries where nobody really got it at all and there was never really a bad spike, then there's not an amount of people who will have antibodies to it. So you're either going to have to not have immigration really to any capacity that could risk putting their population in jeopardy, or you have to wait till there's an effective vaccine, but we might not ever really have an effective vaccine. So you might have this population of people, much like people who were in the Americas before Europeans went there, who are really susceptible to a disease because none of them have ever been in contact with it. So I guess what I'd say is they're not really in the safe zone if none of them have antibodies. And if they lock down early and never got it, it's like, that's fine, but the rest of the world has it. So could you really call what they have successful right now just because people don't have it right now? So I'd look at it from like this multi-year long way of thinking is, does it seem like they're actually going to be able to get antibodies without getting it? Because if they can, they'll be very hyper successful. But at some point, they're going to probably interact with people from other countries, and that might cause the pandemic to come to them because if none of them have immunities, you know what I mean? And at this point, we think that there can be people who are carriers of it that would be asymptomatic, and not every test has a great positive. Not every test is 100%, effective. And usually they only retest people if they have a reason to think you might have coronavirus, and then you get a result that they don't expect. So if you don't have any symptoms and say they're screening you and they give you a test and then you test negative, but you're a an asymptomatic person, like eventually I could see that kind of person go into one of those countries and then nobody has antibodies. And then all of a sudden you start over with having to re-lock down if you don't want those people to ever obtain it, unless you wait out till there's an effective vaccine. So I guess I wouldn't even say that kind of response is necessarily good because you're not progressing towards any kind of group immunity to the virus. Yeah. But yeah, the United States being large is a huge problem in terms of why lockdowns would be less effective, because at least you can get this pseudo efficacy from a small country. From a large country, you're really just lagging the timeline and locking everybody down, but it really just pushed things back. So it kind of delayed it. But since there wasn't any tangible progress, and I had to make the argument that there can't really even necessarily be a lot of tangible progress, it didn't really matter. We kind of just locked down and pushed the timeline on everything back a few weeks, which is bad. Yeah. So if you have more thoughts on that, feel free, because I dumped a lot on you.
So, I guess I'm a little. I need a little more about, I guess, how you're viewing effectiveness or ineffectiveness in this situation. I mean, if a country at this moment, October 28th, 2020, if they are coronavirus free, that doesn't necessarily mean that coronavirus is defeated overall. But that means that community is safe. That community is at least for the time being. That community has for some reason got out of the equation, or out they're not on the field. They're not in the trying to think of, I don't remember what the boxing. It doesn't matter. Anyway, they're no longer players in that respect. I guess I need a little more about that. I'm still confused.
So I think I agree with you. I guess what I'm saying is you're right. It looks effective right now. But the problem is, like, if one country has nobody who has antibodies, right, because nobody's had it, and then we aren't getting particularly close to a vaccine that we know will actually be effective in the long term, at some point you'd think that country would interact with people from other countries, or else they at least have to, they could be open internally, but maybe they'll have to be locked down internationally. So you can argue that what they're doing is on paper very effective right now, but it's still, they're having to lock down from people who have had it in the past or could be potential carriers, because your society is way more vulnerable because nobody has any antibodies. So if I walked in a room and say I had coronavirus, but 20 people in that room all had antibodies, then it doesn't really matter that I have coronavirus because all of them are immune, at least temporarily, because maybe they just all had it a week ago. So maybe all those people are immune. So, but then say if I walked in, was asymptomatic as far as I knew, and I tested negative, and then I go into the Netherlands, and then nobody there has antibodies because nobody's had it, and they've just been completely locked down, and the small amount of cases that have had it have immediately been separated from their families, put in a hotel room, and quarantined. Then anybody I interact with, I'm much more likely to give it to them because they've had no immunity at all because they've been so stringent. So the fact that a lot of people in the United States have had it, and probably a lot more people than we know in the United States have had it, there might be a level of immunity that means one carrier is less likely to transmit it to, say, 5 people and would be more likely to transmit it to one person. But then if you ended up in a country that had been locked down, well locked down, and they don't catch you, then maybe you'll accidentally contaminate 15 because nobody has any antibodies. And that could be very bad. So it's like, yeah, it looks good, but they're not really out of the dark. They're kind of still in peril because as currently they don't have any kind of immunity in terms of on a societal level, in terms of the average person. And when you start breaking down statistics like, okay, if I interacted with somebody with coronavirus and I have no antibodies, what are the odds I get it? Well, and then people interact with so many people in a day. Well, if like 20% of those people have antibodies, then the amount of people who actually end up getting contaminated from you might average be like 0.7. And if the average is less than one person you're giving it to, then the disease is more likely to die out in a region. But if nobody has antibodies and you're interacting in a way that would be more likely to give a person without antibodies coronavirus, and you don't have that reduction factor almost. That's like the argument for herd immunity, and that's the argument for why it's important for you and I to get vaccines. That's the argument that like somebody will make for compulsory vaccines and why your vaccine protects me. That's the kind of argument they make, right? Is because you can't be a carrier. So that means you're less likely to get communicated to you. So it's less likely to be a societal problem because transmission will be stunted from the start. So yeah, I would say like, yeah, you could argue they did good. And then that's another point that we're going to touch on when we talk about looking at things through the lens of several variables or which variables matter. You can make a case that's better because they're not dying right now. That's very valid. I'm just saying they're not really out of the dark. So they're really just perpetually locked down for maybe no reason if there's not a good vaccine.
So you seem to be making the argument that if a particular areas, particular countries are coronavirus free at the moment, that's only a temporary reprieve if humanity as a whole, or if the majority of people as a whole haven't become immune to the virus, because you could still introduce it into that community, and then that could lead to more devastating effects. Is that kind of your thought process?
Yeah. So in a way, at least on that nation's borders, they're pretty much going to have to be on coronavirus lockdown forever if none of the people ever get immunity there. Because anytime somebody comes in and could give it to 10 people, then all of a sudden they have a real epidemic in their country that the U.S. has already maybe partially gone through. And that's probably why we are seeing such a spike in cases, at least right now. And that's, I guess, a topical thing we might end up touching on. But a lot of people are getting it right now because people are finally allowed to go to restaurants in most parts of the country. So people are finally doing things that are more social than before. And a lot of people are getting, infected and probably getting antibodies. And probably more people than we even realize because so many people are allegedly getting it asymptomatically. And that's something I'll probably talk in detail on in a little bit.
Yeah, we can probably move on to your next topic. I just want to say earlier, I was trying to say they were out of the boxing ring. My brain just died. That's what I was trying to say. So I don't sound like a crazy person. I was trying to say these countries are out of the boxing ring.
Yeah, you're good. You're good. Okay. Okay. So this one's a little more. I guess this one's one of the less technical ones. So this I wanted to bring up the idea that in general, policies need to look at several variables, especially when you're like measuring efficacy and success. And right now, it seems like the main metric of success, if you turn on any kind of news outlet or you turn into any kind of briefing, is about the number of cases. And I think talking about minimizing COVID cases as the main goal I don't think that's an effective metric. So I guess my reasoning would be one, in a way, it's arbitrary because we don't actually know how many cases there are. We know how many known cases there are, and there's a big difference. Because a lot of people, if they're allegedly asymptomatic, they aren't going to go get tested unless they have a reason to. So we actually don't really know how many active cases there are. So I throw that out there. The other thing is it makes it so we don't really look at the opportunity cost of any government action. So I guess the example would be we talk about minimizing cases. Look how good we're doing. They're minimizing cases, but we're not talking about like how bad certain societal trends are in response to, say, lockdowns, or in response to, I guess, in general, the shutting down of a lot of things. So like if you look at some information polling of young people or just people in general, like I have this, there was a CNN report from August that said 1 in 4 young people are reporting suicidal thoughts, which was like a huge uptick from year over year. And there's been a lot of polls about mental health in general. And a lot of this is also because a lot of young people overestimate, or if you ask them what their expectation is of, I guess, surviving coronavirus, they will give you numbers that are skewed very high relative to their population. So a lot more people are afraid of the coronavirus, which isn't good on their mental health. And a lot of that's kind of been perpetuated by a lot of the policies about like how kind of scared we need to be or how many precautions we need to take. And I'm not saying the precautions are invalid, but by talking up security to the extent that we have, we make it seem like everybody is in somewhat imminent danger, which isn't really true for large populations of the United States. So you have a lot of these people who are now suddenly out of jobs. So you've seen huge upticks of people who have had suicidal thoughts in poor people, or people who have lost their jobs, or people on the lower income spectrum. Even for people who are like upper middle class, if they lose their job, upper middle class people are more likely to be leveraged and more debt in terms of like housing and stuff like that. So they're not faring well if they lose their jobs. And a lot of this has been in response to the coronavirus combined with the government's response to coronavirus. And I'm not saying restaurants would still be in business if the government didn't do anything. A lot of restaurants would still go under. But I would say a lot of really blunt lockdown policies and a lot of really blunt state policies have probably closed down more stuff than would have happened if people made their own decisions of what they were willing to tolerate in terms of risk. And if you let people say, okay, I'm comfortable because I understand my risks, I'm still willing to go do this, then that place could maybe still do business. But when you have like a state, like say we are making this thing illegal completely for this many months, that company goes, well, we can't afford rent and now we have to go under. And then everybody gets fired. So there's been a lot of events like that where it's like, I'm not saying there wouldn't be economic devastation from even a free market response to coronavirus, because there would be economic devastation. But I'm saying a lot of blunt policies have perpetuated that. And that flows into a lot of things, like because the Great Recession had huge spikes in suicides. And there is like a shorthand stat that is out there that I don't know off the top of my head, but it's about how unemployment coincides with suicide rates and how those things interact. So I guess what I would say is there's a lot of stuff about quality of life that isn't being taken into account when the only thing we talk about is minimizing COVID cases. And I don't think that is intellectually satisfying in any way. And I think it's really crude in terms of thinking. It's very narrow. I mean, well, it's very blunt. It's too broad. So go for it.
Do you know, this is more of a factual question.
Mhm.
I don't know off the top of my head. What are the researchers saying in terms of known cases versus unknown cases?
Oh, okay. I was going to come to that in a little bit. That's actually, I got something from the Wall Street Journal right here. This is from October 6th, so it's not that old. And okay. So this was a quote from Dr. Robert Redfield. So he's head of, okay. Yeah, so he's the head of the CDC, and he said our testing as of late June was picking up perhaps 10% of cases. When we say 40,000 new infections are occurring daily, we might really mean 400,000 infections. When we might imply that 2.2% of Americans have been infected, we may really mean 22%. So, yeah, the amount of people who might have it could be tenfold what we know, and like that hugely would affect the policy breakdown. But instead, we're relying on very obtuse policies that don't really take that into account. And this is my other problem, and I don't have a lot of specific. And this is related to what you're saying. This is really related. This is a huge gripe I have, and this is a rant that I need to go on. It's all about it's about testing, and the reason why is that there is not a single person who can study the state of coronavirus testing in every single state and every single jurisdiction. But we compare these numbers as if they are apples to apples when they're not, because certain states have different requirements for when they test people. So and different regions have different requirements for, I guess, why they might versus situations they might, or versus what kind of employers are open that are testing people. So you could easily look at a random state and say, look, 15% of people we give a test to test positive. That's really bad. And this state's doing better because only 3% of the people they're testing test positive. But they could have completely different diagnostics that go into you getting the test to see if you're positive or negative. So when we look at these things that are about active cases, we're looking at active known cases, but depending on the state's regulations for testing for coronavirus and when you do it and why, like you're going to get completely different numbers, because some states are being very proactive and some states report all the tests they get results for. But if one is testing way more random employees and one's only testing people that come to the hospital, then you're probably going to get huge distributions regardless of what's actually going on in that state, just because you're picking from different population groups within that state. So it's people are comparing these things like they're apples to apples, and it's easy. Obviously, there's a spike in this state versus this state, and then they're drawing conclusions about why masks are effective based on that kind of data. And it's like, unless you can break down the testing regimes and what kind of like ways, the reasoning behind it in each state and what their access is to testing, you can't make these comparisons. They're unreasonable. So that's a big gripe I have with a lot of active case rates too, and that's why I don't think it's a good metric.
Well, there's a lot there. I guess I'll focus at first. We'll return to problems with statistics and
yeah, we definitely are going to talk about a lot of problems.
Yeah, states having different policies. Yeah. But I wanted to begin to talk about the other point you mentioned, which is the costs of shutting down the economy, shutting down restaurants and bars, and telling people to stay in for a certain period of time. And I wanted to talk about it because I was actually listening to a radio program. It was originally a radio program somewhere in the UK, but I found it on YouTube, and it was all about the coronavirus and how it relates to the economy and the cost-benefit analysis that goes into all of that. And it even talked about economists that specialize in basically putting a price on people's lives. I mean, it sounds callous, but there's a reason for it. You know, understanding the cost of doing certain things or other things, and how that affects other people, and how much we need to be concerned with other people versus how much can we just not control and we just have to accept a certain amount of risk. I think am I making sense? Okay, just making sure. So it's an important conversation to have because I agree with you that lockdowns are not, they cannot be sustained forever, and they probably can't be sustained for very long. That there are just too many other social factors which limit our ability to be in quarantine for long amounts of time. I don't think, and I really haven't seen the evidence of people like, oh, we have to be in lockdown forever now until Jesus Christ comes back or whatever. I don't really hear the people who are going that extreme. I think most people would say at some point we have to cut it off and go back to semi-normal life. I think the question is, or what I would need to be convinced on, is that kind of goes back to the whole how we started the conversation in the first place. Is I'm not actually convinced that that shutting down society is necessarily a bad thing, or that it's necessarily not effective given our circumstances. Because to a certain extent, and this is almost, I'm going to try to stop myself before I begin to get into social contract territory, but to a certain extent, I think we do need to make sacrifices for the benefit of the community. We might have disagreements on what those quote unquote sacrifices are, or when to do them, or how to do them. But I don't think, I think in something like a pandemic, I think the individualism that an anarcho-capitalist espouses really breaks down from my perspective. And so I guess I'd like to hear a little more about your thoughts on all that.
Yeah. Okay. So when we talk about society being on lockdown and how bad that really is, I was trying to pull up another article I had because it was more specific about like the drastic rates of increase in essentially depression and things similar to depression because people can't do things anymore. And I think that that's something that can't be glossed over. And it's one of the things that has had such a spike that it's like arguable that the coronavirus lockdowns is even having a real net positive effect if you look at a real time horizon. Because when you lock down for 2 weeks and there's not all of a sudden a vaccine 2 weeks later, then you're really just delaying the spread because the amount of, I guess, people who are immune in the system has not increased or changed even in a good lockdown. And you'd assume some amount exists because you literally can't lock down everything. You still have to have some people working at certain stores, and you still have to be able to go to a grocery store. So you're still going to have some level of transmission, and then people are still open to be, infected. So then that transmission will obviously increase whenever you decide to reopen. It's inevitable. You can't completely prevent transmission, so the numbers will always increase. So you're really just pushing back those increases. You're just saying, okay, well, we want to push it back. And then the other issue is the longer you do the lockdown, the less people abide by the rules and the more it loses public support. And this isn't really a thing that, I guess this is where I think the lockdown theorists completely fall apart, is it's easy to say, well, if we all lock down until we have a very effective vaccine, then no more people really have to die because we pretty much stunt transmission, even though there's still be a small amount, and then everybody gets something that makes them immune. But the reason that doesn't work is because, as you'll hear pretty much any very far left-wing person on Twitter say, is they say, if we really locked down for 2 weeks and followed the rules, this wouldn't be the problem. And this is the problem of the people who are in the red states that don't take it seriously. And what I would say is, no, that's not the issue at all. Because the 2 week lockdown doesn't eradicate the disease. It would still transmit at a more than 1-to-1 person ratio, whether you're taking all the precautions or not, and you don't have a surefire fix. So all you've really done is delayed it. So yeah. And then if you say, well, it's just those people in the red states, it's like even in places that are very liberal, after several months of being locked down, people would stop following all the rules. That's why in like places that are seen as like in California, which is thought of as like a liberal bastion, people got their water shut off and their utilities shut off because they were having parties, and the government found out they had a party and they threatened to shut off their utilities, and they did. And pretty much what I'm saying is there isn't a society where you would actually be able to convince people to fully lock down. So if you say, but if we did, it's like, okay, but you're existing in a sandbox of your imagination where people won't do that unless you threaten to shoot them if they walk outside. So I guess what I'm saying is whether you're ideologically skewed that way or not, to think people should follow the rules, once you get a long enough time of lockdown, people get lockdown fatigue and don't follow the rules. And there's also this other bad thing that happens with lockdowns where if the rates seem low, even though that's a good thing, it makes people go, now I don't need to take any precautions because the rate's really low. And that's part of what restarts the cycle of, and then people who don't have immunity, since nobody got immunity, now get it because people aren't as worried because the rates were really low. But it's still a contagious thing that we didn't eradicate. So I would say a lot of the things with lockdowns are based on a false sense of security. It looks more secure than it is, but really pushes off the problem. And then it doesn't really work in practice because nobody actually completely abides by the rules because people aren't willing to. And it's like, do I wish they would? Maybe, but they just aren't. People just stop obeying them after a few months. So you can't even really say they should because they won't. You know what I mean? Is that fair?
I need another point of clarification. So, from my perspective, I think kicking the can down the road can be helpful if the vaccine that they create is quite beneficial. It doesn't necessarily mean the vaccine has to cure coronavirus for all time, but it has to be effective enough to where immunity. It has to be effective enough to where the virus numbers, the cases go down, and we start the public health begins to get back to or close to where it was before. But I guess what I hear you saying is, I guess you disagree with it because it's ineffective, or do you disagree with it at a more fundamental level?
So I'm saying it could be. So I'm not even making the ANCAP arguments just because that's a non-starter with our ideological predispositions. I'm making a consequentialist argument against it. I'm not even basing off liberty or anything. I'm just saying it could be effective in terms of limiting spread for a few weeks, but like there were a bunch of charts of people's anonymized cellular data that showed as the longer the lockdown went on, people started leaving their house a lot more. So what I'm saying is in practice, you tell people to stay at home and you can show that even if the rules don't change, people stop caring after a certain point. Even if things are closed, they still start going and doing things more. And those things make the lockdown ineffective. And then I also think there's no reason to assume a vaccine will be as effective to the degree that we're hoping it is. Because in practice, it appears, based on the evidence that's out there, that coronavirus is more likely to be something that has multiple strains and could somewhat adapt than it is something that you could just take a vaccine and be good. And it seems like immunity isn't necessarily permanent. So if you're staking it all on people abiding by a lockdown for a long amount of time and the immunity being very good for a long amount of time, it's like both those things are unlikely. People are going to stop abiding by the lockdown, and people are going to like you don't want to hedge everything on the vaccine necessarily being very, very effective.
Do you know? You might not know the answer to this question. I'm just curious. The studies you've seen about people disobeying lockdown, the longer the lockdown is that are they doing that? Are they looking at human behavior across different countries, or are they focusing in the United States? Or do you even know the answer to that?
Most of the stuff I've looked at is in the United States. And the reason why most stuff I look at is in the United States is because when you observe things that are in different nations, then it's like it just shows how obviously different nations should have different responses, because it can be based on a country's culture. Because like you could imagine that maybe like some European country like Germany maybe might be a lot more obedient to certain things than maybe California or Florida or something. So it's been a lot more United States based. And it's also tough to compare data across countries because you look at like Italy, and one of the main reasons why people die there so much is because there's so many more smokers. Their median age skews high, and people are more likely to live with their grandparents. And it's like those are three very important factors. So why would we compare any of their government decisions versus any other countries when other countries don't have those like very important factors? So most of what I've looked at is based around the United States.
I only ask because I can't help but speculate that. Well, we'll get into, I guess, how bad or how good the coronavirus pandemic has been in the United States and what we think about the numbers and all that stuff. But from my perspective, or from what I've read about it, the numbers don't look good. The numbers don't look good at all. At some level, it doesn't, as I said in the last podcast, it doesn't matter to me if China's numbers are worse or Russia's numbers are worse and they're just reporting false numbers. It matters to me that the numbers in the U.S. are pretty bad.
Now, okay,
and I think
one thing I would just want to say, though, on that is if you compare states, though, like if you look at New York and New Jersey's death mortality rate per 100,000 and you compare it to some other states that are like more innocuous that people don't talk about, those states have vastly higher mortality rates. And the more apt comparison for the US is looking at like the whole like EU area. Because then you get places like Italy who handled it like hell, just like New York did in the beginning of March, right? And then they were also predisposed to be worse off because of things like how close people live together. And then you actually have like a fair way of looking at 50 different states by looking at all these countries together. And when you compare all of like that area's numbers against the US's numbers, they're pretty close. And I'm not saying like, oh yeah, it's 100 people off, but I'm saying it's not as off as you'd expect based on like the CNN coverage. I'm just saying, and I know I don't expect you to necessarily like believe that because you're taking my word for it, because I haven't really heard that many people reporting that. But if we're going to start comparing the U.S. to other countries, I think it's like kind of a fool's errand, and that's like I think that's the I don't really think the U.S. is doing uniquely bad.
Well, that's where I'm not sure you're right, or I need more evidence to think about that.
That's fair.
Or need more evidence to come to that conclusion. Because the whatever, like the number that's being touted, it was at 210,000 or even over that now. Like it's not a perfect number, of course. And different. Like I accept that different states have different circumstances. Some might do a little worse, a little better than others.
So some do a lot worse in terms of.
Some do a lot worse, and some do a lot better. But let me finish this quick point, then I'll let you jump in. It does seem to me, though, that it does seem to me that the numbers, however we're going to interpret them, they're relatively a good amount of deaths. And of course, the question, I won't at the moment. I won't get into the question of whether like how much of that was preventable or not. But I have this little like hypothesis. It's not really a testable hypothesis, but I think if we assume, or if we come to the conclusion that the U.S. hasn't done well or as well as it could have, I think some of that goes back to just cultural issues that the U.S. has. I think certain European countries, and again, I know you said it's a fool's errand to compare European countries, but bear with me for a moment. European countries, in some ways, they have a slightly different interpretation of government or a different relationship with government. And I think that probably leads to many more people following certain orders about quarantine in like European countries than they would in the United States. I don't know if you want to comment on that, but that is definitely a thought that I've had. I think that it's so ingrained in our culture to hate the government and to be suspicious of the government, and to scream about liberty. But I appreciate, though, by the way, I appreciate you haven't talked too much about that. You're focusing on other things and talking about it in different ways, and I appreciate that. But I think a lot of this, a lot of people disregarding these rules, it does boil down to, well, I feel like the government's taking away my liberty, and I don't want that. But then there's, of course, the question of, well, is that liberty that you're talking about in that situation in the middle of a pandemic, is that much better than what we're doing now? And so these are a lot of questions that I kind of just threw at you, but I think it's a good place to continue a good way to continue the discussion.
I like that you brought that up because it gives me the opportunity to hammer a point home that I think is important, and I think it's a point that a lot of technocrats get wrong. And I think this is also a point that why like a lot of central planning policies just don't work. Whether you value freedom or not, it's the reason why they don't work. And the reason they don't work is because you actually have to take that into consideration when you design a policy. So that's why you could say, here's what Germany did and it worked. And then you could say Trump should have done it. And then it's like, well, no, because lockdowns would be way more effective than in, say, Germany than in the United States because of different cultures. And you could say, well, maybe our culture shouldn't be this way, or maybe this is a point against our culture being this way, or maybe it'd be better if our culture acted in different ways or responded in different ways. But in the end, when you're designing policy, you work with the situation in front of you. And the situation in front of us is we have a country where a lot of people are like me, and they say, I observe the government's actions with skepticism, and I feel like when they do things, they need to meet a very high barrier for me to accept it. And whether you agree with that line of thought or not, a lot of people think that way. And because people think that way, it innately hamstrings lockdown approaches. And you can't just whine and say, okay, well, I wish we just had a real lockdown. It's no, we live in a society that the lockdown, that option is off the table because people won't respect it, so it won't work. And although you could say that sucks and other countries lock down and it worked, it doesn't mean it would work here, because you can't change societal values when you put the policy in and hit enter and get everybody to sign off on it. So it's like, to some point you might be right, but I would say it almost makes my case for me, because it shows that lockdowns won't work here, and that shows that more lockdowns wouldn't have worked here, and then that's not the right way to react and say we didn't have enough lockdowns. That's wrong, because it would have worked poorly. So that's the way that I've kind of conceptualized that.
I'm just going to throw out a really big question, a slightly provocative question as well. I'm just gonna you can roll with it in whatever direction you want. What would you say? Like what's the human cost that we're willing to accept if if I accept everything you've said up to this point, or if some member of the audience accepts everything you said up to this point, it's like, okay, Matt, I'm becoming a bit skeptical of the effectiveness of lockdowns in the U.S. Or I just think, are they ineffective, or all this stuff. What would you say then to someone who's like, well, in that case, you just have to accept a lot of deaths? Do you have a response to that, or do you not accept that question? Are you suspicious that we'd actually have the amount of deaths that some professionals say we would, or what's your thought process in that regard?
So when it comes to tolerance, I guess, for people getting the disease or dying from it, so the first point I'd probably make is I'd undercut the lockdown side by just reiterating the point about how lockdowns a lot of times are pushing it off. So even if you say, well, during the lockdown there's no deaths, it's like, yeah, but it's not stopping the ones immediately after, and it's not sustainable. You can't just lock down forever. So it's like, okay, that's not even really an option on the table to compare against. Now, what I would say is, if you leave it to people to make their own individual decisions, you may have a different amount of deaths, but it is people who have proactively done things that have been, it's informed consent. So I could look at the data as a 23-year-old, and I could say, okay, if I go to Disneyland, I'm going to be interacting with a lot of people in a place, but a lot of it's outside, but there are some inside rides that I might be somewhat near people, maybe 4.5 feet away. And I know my health background, so maybe I'll be putting myself at a little more risk than I'd like to. Well, even though Disneyland's open, that doesn't mean I'll go to it if I'm uncomfortable with my own risk. So a lot of people who opt into these situations where they're more likely to be put at risk, like if they go to the White House Rose Garden celebration without masks, and there's a ton of people outside that they don't know, well, then maybe those people have done something that is knowingly, based on the information, more risky. And even if they do later die from it, it's they can evaluate their own health better than I can evaluate it for them. So I'd say even if people are dying, it is people who have self-selected into situations that have made them more likely to be at risk. Unlike the lockdown, where you forcefully select everybody to be in a situation that is supposed to be minimizing risk, but is generally just minimizing short-term risk. So like right now, if I was really concerned, if I was a person who was very worried about my health, the only time I'd probably leave my house would be to go to the grocery store. And if I go to the grocery store, I can take a lot of precautions just on my own end. And I can go to grocery stores that I can tell are being pretty strict about coronavirus. If I go to a grocery store once and I see people aren't wearing their masks and it puts me off, then I'm going to go to like a Whole Foods that I know is probably just culturally going to be more strict on on coronavirus lockdowns. But if somebody says, well, I want to go to the movies and the movies aren't going to be that crowded and I'm willing to sit in the movie theater, I don't see why they shouldn't have been allowed to do that 6 months ago. But they're just now being allowed to do that again in the last 2 months in terms of a legal basis. So I would say there could arguably be more deaths, but people are pre-selecting into it. The other thing I would say is when we talk about the phrase herd immunity, which people have like an incorrect trigger negative reaction to because it implies that we want people to go get it and it'll be okay. It's like when you get vaccinated, you're building towards herd immunity because you're becoming, the population's becoming more immune to something. There's just two ways to reach it, by either getting the disease and being somewhat immune or getting the vaccine and being somewhat immune. So what I would say is if everybody's evaluating their own risk, then a lot more young people will probably give it to other young people. And I don't see why that's necessarily a bad thing as long as you are very aware of it. Because if you're very aware of it, then you just say, hey, 23-year-old, that's my grandson. If you're doing risky things, I don't want to associate with you unless you stop doing risky things. And that sucks, but that's a relationship decision you have to make with your family. It's not a decision that people should be making for you, really. And then you can go, okay, I'm being risky about it because I'm kind of okay with my health and I don't really think I'll get it. If I do get it, I'll probably be fine. It's like that's a fair decision. And that person may very well get it, be asymptomatic, and now increase that herd immunity. But if they're locked down, they might hate their life a lot more, not be allowed to make their own decision, and not be raising that bar to get to herd immunity. The only times young people getting it is dangerous is when they're getting it and then giving it to an old person, or if they like had lymphoma when they were a kid. So like if I got it, I don't think anybody should be concerned for me because I'm a very healthy 23-year-old. So the odds of me even being hospitalized or really even knowing I had it are incredibly low. So I guess that's my big picture response is a lot of people could still be secure if they want to. You can still self-lock down. And if you're self-locked down, you're not leaving your house. So who's going to be giving it to you? And then the people who are doing things that are now seem irresponsible to you might have higher risk tolerances and might be very healthy. And if they are, then I don't see why that's unreasonable. And it might even increase herd immunity. So that might even be better for society. There's a case that it could be better for society if those people aren't at a high risk group and they won't die. So I think I know that's a lot. I apologize. I kind of just went off.
No, you're fine. So
did that make sense?
I followed. Yeah, no, I followed you completely. I followed you completely.
So sometimes I don't know when I get in the zone, and that sounds kind of arrogant in a way, but it's like I'm just saying like the internalized reasoning here at this point.
No, I followed you completely. And this is almost, I don't know, this point is almost like abstract and philosophical, so we don't have to dwell on it too long. But are you sort of saying, or I guess the argument I hear you making is at some level we need to treat coronavirus cases as, or if you get it, it might have been due to your own irresponsibility. And I'm not trying to simplify your argument or you're saying everyone's stupid and dumb and you hate everybody. But I guess what I hear you almost saying or talking about is personal responsibility. The individual's responsibility to figure out for themselves the amount of risks they're going to take and how those risks could affect themselves and those around them. But I don't hear you saying that we need to think about this at a like government level, and that when we think about it at a government level, when we think about it from the level of like the social contract almost, I hear you. I think you're skeptical of that. Well, is that a fair characterization?
So the 2 points I make is any infectious disease you get is generally contagious from another person or from some kind of environment you're in. And generally, you can be in the control of what environment you're in or who you interact with. So it does boil down to your human action, even if the government interferes, because you're still making choices. So, I mean, in the end, I don't even want to make the like politicized or theoretic or the philosophical claim that, your human action is the most important thing. I'm just saying that is inevitable if we're talking about infectious disease. So like if you get like if you get a cold because and you're sneezing and coughing, it's usually because somebody was sneezing and coughing around you, and you chose to be in a place, last year, like you went to class because you'd go to class and you knew there was a risk you get a cold, and it's not a big deal because whatever. So it's just now you have to bake coronavirus into your decision making. Okay, I'm going to go to this crowded place, and I know there's a risk, just like getting the cold or just like any other infectious disease. So I'm not really trying to say that that's the more ethical way of looking at it. I'm just saying that is inherently inevitable, and you can't even change that. Now, when we talk about government involvement, I'm almost making the efficacy case. I'm not making why it's the government's necessarily bad. I'm just saying it's hard to determine what the correct metrics to make policy is, and human action leads to, I guess, in a way, the best allocation of the disease, because it's the people who are getting it are usually self-selecting into it, or at least self-selecting into the risk of getting it. So it's usually people who are going to be more safe, and it's not as blunt because it's not taking away any unnecessary livelihoods. So you're not taking away like the opportunities to go do things for people or to go do their job by just bluntly saying all these things have to be closed. And I guess the last point on that front I'd make is when you have the government, say, imposing a lockdown, it does affect public opinion in a way that's like hard to measure the efficacy of. And I think they make it sound like it's misleadingly good. So when they spent a lot of the summer talking about how a lot of numbers were down in certain places because people were being good and like staying in, but now we're seeing a rise. So it kind of can be misleading. It's like, oh, we have low numbers now, with the implication that we're not going to have low numbers in a month if we let up at all. So that's kind of like if you're looking at a lot of states, they have these like red, yellow, green type phases. And you start at the red phase and it's like, look, all the numbers are low. We'll open up places to 25% capacity. And then it's like, no surprise here, the rates went up because you've now increased vectors of transmission. So all these things aren't really doing anything in the long term. They're just they're seemingly effective because it's like, oh yeah, our transmission decreased for 3 weeks, and then they have chaos because then they say, well, now transmission's increasing. This isn't good, because they are only looking at one or two measurements. And I don't think there's any reason to think those are either the right measurements to even look at, or that they're necessarily doing anything that's noteworthy because they're just changing the time that these infections are happening. So it's almost like you don't even need to start with the state, because it's almost like they're just messing with the time people get cases as opposed to really doing anything meaningful other than, you can make the political case other than like taking away people's rights. And I'd probably make all those cases. But in terms of efficacy about the coronavirus, I don't really think it's even having a big picture. If you look at the long-term damage, I don't think it's having a big effect. Now, somebody could take what I just said and they could say, where's I going with this? I was going to try to lay out a counter argument for an argument that apparently I'm probably not qualified to make. So that's a dumb thing to do. So I'm not going to lay it out. Did you have another thought you wanted to bounce off about that, talking about, I guess, the state?
I think we can move on to another point, actually.
Okay.
I mean, we'll be continually talking about the state and its influence throughout the conversation. But
okay, so a lot of the things I'm going to talk about now are about why certain metrics might be bad or misleading, and why a lot of the, I guess, ideas we have about the coronavirus might be flawed because we might just be drawing assumptions based on data that might not even be helpful. And one of the reasons why I bring this up is because a broad principle that people who are generally small government is that government kind of needs a probable cause to impose a regulation, or they need to have some kind of evidence that it will help. But I guess there are a lot of metrics I would point to and say these might be fundamentally flawed, and a lot of our information might be fundamentally wrong. So I put a lot of things in this sector, some that we've already touched on, like how we talked about how we might be able to test and see that 2.2% of people had it, but the factor could really be 10 in terms of the ones we don't know about. So it really could be 22% of people had it, and we aren't really sure. And that is really important if you're trying to dictate policy, but it's a piece of information we just don't have access to, which really means any policy we make can't effectively understand that factor. So our decision making would be flawed fundamentally. Okay. So so we already referenced that one. The thing I'll talk about now is this is like a little known study that I think is really significant. And this is when I bust out the paper. So this was from the New York Times. It was published on August 29th and was updated in September. And and it was titled "Your Coronavirus Test is Positive, Maybe It Shouldn't Be." And I was completely shocked at this. Well, in a way, I was completely shocked this didn't get much media play, but it's kind of predictable because it doesn't really fit the narrative very well. And if the media has bad intentions about fear mongering, then this wouldn't be something they want to report. Um, Pretty much the idea about this is it breaks down the PCR tests that are used, and the PCR tests are like the very common types of tests used in measuring if people test positively or negatively for coronavirus. It's called a PCR test. Um, so essentially, what this article is saying is they talked to a few doctors, um, and a lot of this data, it's pretty much questioning the threshold of what makes a positive coronavirus test versus a negative coronavirus test, and saying the threshold we are using may be very, very wrong. Okay, so here, let me try to find. I should have highlighted the thing I was going to quote. And it also does allude to how by not testing asymptomatic people, you're kind of getting skewed data. Okay, let's see. And if I linger too long, I guess I'll cut 20 seconds here or there. Okay, so here's quoting the article. It said, in 3 sets of testing data that include cycle thresholds compiled by officials in Massachusetts, New York, and Nevada, up to 90% of people testing positive carried barely any virus. On Thursday, the U.S. recorded 45,000 new coronavirus cases. Okay. And then it goes on to say, if the rates of contagiousness in Massachusetts and New York were applied nationwide, then perhaps only 45,000 of those people may actually need to isolate and submit to contact tracing. So it's pretty much saying that when they use their PCR thresholds that were currently used in those states, they were diagnosing about 90% of the people that tested positive as positive, even if they were very, very, very unlikely to have enough coronavirus in them to actually be able to give coronavirus to another person. And then it goes on to say, one solution would be to adjust the cycle threshold used now to decide when a patient is infected. Most tests are set the limit at 40, a few at 37. This means that you are positive for the coronavirus if the test process required up to 40 cycles or 37 cycles to detect the virus. But Dr. Mina, who she gave her credentials earlier in the piece, she is an epidemiologist at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. She said that a more reasonable cutoff would be 30 to 35. Dr. Mina said he would set the figure at 30 or even less. Those changes would mean the amount of genetic material in a patient sample would have to be 100-fold to 1,000-fold that of the current standard for a return to test positive. And the reason why he says it should be lower is because he's saying that's the point where we should take action on you in terms of isolating you because you're actually contagious. So, and it goes on to talk more about the cutoff rates. So, and it really, this article is, it's really worth looking into. It's a quick read too. It's like 5 pages. It's called "Your Coronavirus Test is Positive, Maybe It Shouldn't Be." So I recommend people Google it if they're listening to this, just because it's kind of mind blowing. But it's just the simple idea that we're using a test, and it goes without saying that a test could be, have like a 10% false positive rate. But if we're even just thinking about the test itself, the way, like, most people don't understand how a test is done in the background. And the way this test is working is it appears making people seem way more likely to be carriers of the disease than they are in practice, which means we may be overstating most of the metrics that we're seeing on TV. So when you hear that there are 40,000 new active cases, well, if the PCR test is 37 to 40 in those places where they're, cycling it 40 times to see if there's any coronavirus, in the sample, versus testing it 30 times where you would, have to have a much higher amount of coronavirus in the sample to test positive. And that's like a very important difference, because maybe if we had decided it was 45 cycle tests, maybe we'd think the number would be 22%, right? And that harkens back to the article we cited before about how maybe way more people have had coronavirus. So I guess the big picture point is we don't really know. And when we talk about cases like how there's 40,000 new cases in a day, well, really the amount of contagious cases might be 4,000, but we're talking about this giant number, and it terrifies people, and that might be bad. So that's the first article I wanted to roll out there. If you have any reaction to that before I move on a little bit more. So we're gonna look. So I pulled up an article from the New York Times, and it's called "Your Coronavirus Test is Positive, Maybe It Shouldn't Be," and it came out on August 29th. And the lead line is, "The usual diagnostic test may simply be too sensitive and too slow to contain the spread of the virus." And this whole article is just kind of about how the PCR tests they're using might be ineffective. So a lot of this cites Dr. Michael Mina, who's an epidemiologist at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and it goes into kind of his thoughts. And he pretty much says the yes-no tests aren't good enough. It's the amount of virus that should dictate the infected patient's next step. And then he said, quote, "It's really irresponsible, I think, to forgo the recognition that this is a quantitative issue." So just the idea of us having positive and negative active cases is kind of silly. He says the PCR test amplifies genetic matter from the virus in cycles. The fewer cycles required, the greater the amount of virus or viral load in the sample. The greater the viral load, the more likely the patient is to be contagious. So that means if you do less cycles, but it's positive, that means the viral load is higher, and that means the person's actually contagious. So then he talks about how in 3 sets of testing data from Massachusetts, New York, and Nevada, up to 90% of the people testing positive carried barely any virus. And then he said most tests at the limit at 40 or a few at 30 PCR cycles. And then he goes on to say a more reasonable cutoff would be 30 to 35. And he would set the figure at 30 or even less. So that could potentially decrease the amount of cases by 100-fold or 1,000-fold. At least the cases that are worth acting on. And then just a couple more points he made that I think are worth acknowledging. Is officials at a New York State lab, they have access to their CT values that they processed. So in July, they identified 872 positive tests based on a 40 cycle threshold. But with a cutoff of 35 cycles, only about 43% of those tests, well, about 43% of that initial 872 would no longer be positive. And if the threshold was 30 cycles, then 63% of those 872 would also no longer be positive. So this PCR threshold that nobody's talking about could drastically change the amount of active cases from a lab. So yeah, he says in Massachusetts, it says in Massachusetts from 85 to 90% of people who tested positive in July with a cycle threshold of 40 would have been deemed negative if the threshold were 30 cycles. And then that doctor said, "I would say that none of these people should be contact traced, not one." So when you hear a lot of stuff on the news about how we should be contact tracing, and when people are active, we don't really know anything about what their viral load is, or if they're actually contagious, or if it really matters they tested positive, or if the test that tested them positive was too, loose with it. And when we get these numbers of cases, we don't really know how many matter or what matters. And that can be misleading when we talk about certain places that are like hot zones, because maybe they just have higher PCR cycles. We don't really know. So it's kind of weird that people are making policy recommendations based on it all. It's like a huge variable that's clearly unclear. So reactions.
I would say actually out of everything we've talked about so far, I would say you sound. I'm more convinced, or I'm convinced mostly by what you said. In that I think the way people think about positive and negative results, the way the average person thinks about it, the way the media portrays it, is most certainly either invalid or just it's only a half truth. So that would be definitely something I would want to look into more. I actually wanted to. Well, I'm going to ask you a question, and if you feel it's irrelevant, you can just say we can just move on. But I'm just kind of curious. Earlier, you were talking about how you think the media is overblowing. I don't remember the exact phrase you used, but the media is kind of catastrophizing and scaring people, and is almost thinking that this is the worst case, that we're living in the worst case scenario. And I just wanted a few more thoughts on what you mean by that. I don't, because I think when I think about the media, or when I trust the media, obviously it depends on the situation. Generally, I trust. I generally trust the facts they report, quote unquote, but not necessarily. I'm not necessarily trusting their interpretation of the facts or their overall narrative. So I'm just curious where you think like what the media's role is in this entire pandemic situation.
Yeah, well, I have like the negative view on the average person's in terms of critically analyzing news. So I think I think naturally the media has been really bad in terms of saying things that are misleading. Now I think that happens almost every time the media reports on any kind of narrative. They say things that are very broad and they report things that reemphasize a narrative, whether they're particularly accurate or not. And there are certain things we can see that at least to some extent kind of reflect that. One of the articles I don't think I was actually going to discuss, yeah, I don't have it pulled up here. I'd seen it earlier today. It was about how initially during the onset of coronavirus around March, young people were actually more afraid of getting the virus themselves than a lot of older people. And that just shows it's partially partisan skewness, right? Because Republican people skew older and they're less likely to be afraid of coronavirus. But it's also just young people have been convinced that coronavirus is dangerous, and a lot of liberal people are saying coronavirus is dangerous. So you're supposed to listen to the people on your team, and they think that they're really at risk. And that's really bad because a lot of young people don't have a lot of good reason to be scared. And it's like, I think you should have your own evaluation and act on your own evaluation. But if you're going to be somewhat quantitative about it, they have like the lowest mortality rates by far. And a lot of them don't have the pre-existing health conditions that older people have. So there's really no reason for like huge percentages of young people to be afraid of coronavirus. And I think as we get further into like lockdowns and just it existing, they're realizing it because they're not hearing about anybody their age dying, and the statistics are becoming more clear. But yeah, I would attribute that in some way to the media. And I would say it's given people a false impression. Also, people don't really go to the hospital and see what's going on because why would you? So it's not like anybody can compare what the media is telling them to their own personal interpretation of events unfolding before them because you're just holed up in your house watching the news. So to some extent, it's hard to say the validity. Well, what I can tell you is you have talking heads on the news advising people in government on how they should and shouldn't run the country, quote unquote, run the country. Yet they don't talk about things like how PCR tests would greatly skew results and how a lot of the data we're using, it's unclear that they're even equalized in any way that is satisfying. So all the things they're saying are kind of based on a foundation of, I guess, false premises or false assumptions, which is probably bad. That's me hating on the media. Now, I think that kind of flows into this, and this is a more arguably contentious topic, but I don't have like a contentious take on it.
I have a quick follow-up if that's okay.
Yeah, you can go for it.
And I kind of wanted to tie in, your favorite human being on the planet, Dr. Fauci. And I this is just kind of a broad point, which anyone could really make. But I'm not a medical professional. You're not a medical professional. What I guess what I'm trying to ask is, given your perception of the whole situation, what makes you think that without the proper, without a background in virology, without a background in just human health in general, what would you say that what would you say? I'm not questioning the validity of what you're saying, but I guess what I'm thinking about is, what would you say to the person who is a little suspicious of what you're saying because you're not a doctor, or a virologist, or you don't research these things for a living, because that's often where I fall. I fall or I'm in a place where I don't feel I don't know enough about the inner workings of viruses. I know very little about human health as a whole. So I'm in a difficult position where I can't really evaluate certain health claims, because I don't have the tools necessary to do that. And so that leads me to, not always, but generally, to accept what the medical professionals are saying. Now, there's some debate here. There is some debate. Obviously, there is some difference of opinion across a wide variety of on a wide variety of issues. But there does seem to be there does seem to be consensus on quite a few of these things. But I feel like that consensus goes against what you're saying in what you've been talking about in this whole podcast. So I just want a few words from you about, what you think your role is in this whole conversation, despite the fact that neither of us really know the first thing about medicine.
So I think it's actually really a really simple answer, and I think it's a really good answer because it's really simple. And it's that, well, okay, I'll give the simple answer and then I'll give the big elaboration. The simple answer is it's because if you work in the medical field and you work especially in public health, you have the goal of maximizing one or two variables. And we spent the first half of this episode talking about why it seems like policies are trying to maximize certain results that aren't necessarily optimal, and why it might be important to look at things more holistically. So a lot of these health professionals say, well, these are things to lower risk, so you should do all of the things to lower risk. So it's like, okay, but then they don't talk about marginal effects, right? So it's like a doctor can straight up tell you if you're interacting with more people, you're putting yourself at a higher risk. But they aren't saying, and then generally the conclusions that when they're put in front of Congress is, well, then you should do things that minimize that. So lock everybody down. And it maximizes these contingencies. So they have the interest of like the vague public health, which is we don't want people to get something that we know is an illness. So how do you maximize that? Well, we make those things mostly banned. It's simple. But they aren't looking at things, I guess, in a holistic way. Because they aren't thinking of, okay, but culturally, will people actually abide by this for 6 months, right? And they aren't really forecasting a lot of different variables. They're looking at it narrowly through this very specific short-term lens of is this a good thing or a bad thing for people to do when you talk about coronavirus? And I'm not even disagreeing with most of those things, right? I'm not telling people that they shouldn't. I'm not telling people it's extra safe to go out with your friends without a mask on. I'm not telling you should do that. I'm just saying that the idea of lockdowns isn't really shown to be effective over a long time horizon. And it seems obvious to just tell people, well, if we know that hanging out in groups of people is bad, why don't we ban it? So a lot of these people who are epidemiologists, or even people who see patients, they aren't the ones who are supposed to craft policy either. And it kind of goes to why you don't really like economists, because it seems like economists mostly focus on maximizing certain things. And then you would say, well, they're only talking about this, though. Why are they only talking about this variable? Why are they only trying to maximize this with this policy? That seems silly. And that's kind of what it is with the public health experts. It's like they're clearly saying, well, we should do the most extreme thing that is against remotely spreading the virus. But there's no reason to assume that's optimal. So I push back on most of it. That's okay. So I'm going to jump into a couple things about masks. And it's more of just to address, this is also kind of a media criticism. And it's not that I'm anti-mask, because I'm not at all. It's just to say everything has a trade-off. And it's stupid when people don't recognize trade-offs. And it's annoying. So when we talk about masks, this is an article I pulled from Snopes. Snopes reprinted both these articles I'll talk about. It's because I wanted to go somewhere that seems credible from, like, I guess, left-wing people. That's where I'd rather start. And it's Snopes saying potential consequences of wearing face masks. So And it just cites a few random things. So, like, although we don't have clear evidence that this is happening during the pandemic, a few studies conducted before the outbreak found that people did indeed have worse hand hygiene when wearing a mask. Second, to offer any protection, masks need to be worn correctly and consistently when in contact with other people. And as most people on the left often get angry when they see people wearing masks incorrectly, and we know that a lot of people just like don't cover their mouth and nose at all times. So a lot of things that people say have presumptions that are like, well, we assume that masks will do X, Y, and Z. And it's because you assume people do it to the maximum efficacy. But I just think that's a silly assumption. And I'm not saying masks are bad. I'm just saying when people say mask wearing will cause all these things to not happen, it's like, yeah, but you're assuming that people wear them right. And much like the lockdown discussion, it's like, but we know a lot of them aren't going to. So it's like, yeah, they should. But then it's like, I'm in Philadelphia where people aren't anti-maskers, but there'll be people who are just kind of lazy about it. And they're like normal people. And then they just like, oh, this is uncomfortable, pull it below the nose. And that happens all the time. And then the other point from this article is just public health bodies now recommend that members of the public use masks in places where it's difficult to maintain social distancing. We strongly urge readers to carry on with good hand hygiene and social distancing, not touching their face and using reusable rather than disposable face coverings, and safely disposing of them at the end of their useful life. So it's also like, I think that touches on the fact that a lot of people are told to wear masks, but then you have to remember a lot of people are wearing disposable masks like a dozen times and not changing them out. And people are, shoving their masks in their pockets. And it's like, if it's protecting you from incoming things in the air and it's hitting your mask instead of going in you, that's great. But then you put it in your pocket and then it gets all over your hands and then you're touching your face later. So what I'm saying is masks can be effective, and they are still effective, probably despite all those things I said. But people often overestimate things by not talking about these trade-offs. And it seems silly when people act like masks are a be-all, end-all solution when it's like, yeah, they're effective. But it's like, a bunch of people are going to misuse them because that's just what people do for just about everything. They do most things very suboptimally, and that needs to be baked into the cake. So that's just a factor that I think needs to be recognized. Should I keep going?
No, I have something to say.
Okay.
And I want to put this in the most charitable way possible. That's a bad way to start a sentence, isn't it? What I kind of I'm a little unsure about when you're talking about face masks, and this kind of also goes back to just shutting society down for a certain period of time. I almost hear you say, or someone could misconstrue you into saying that just because something is not completely effective, it means that it's not effective at all, or just because we can't wear face masks perfectly, or just because we can't institute quarantine perfectly, that means we shouldn't wear masks and we shouldn't shut things down and quarantine. Now, you did say you're not against masks, so that's important to remember. But what would you say to someone who just who thinks you're who might think that that you are you're giving up on the solutions because they're not perfect, or you're giving up on possible solutions or possible procedures or policies just because they're not perfect.
Yeah. So you started that by saying somebody can misconstrue me as arguing that, and it's like, that's fair. They can misconstrue me, but I guess what I'm getting at is people will point to lockdowns and they'll point to why doesn't everyone wear masks all the time, as if these are remedies, as if they are factors that could pretty much remove the risk to some extent, to remove the risk significantly, or even like be borderline eradication. So people will say, well, if only this state was better about wearing masks, then this wouldn't be a problem. And it's like, well, you do have to remember that it's not like wearing masks all of a sudden, saved blue states, because every place is seeing like a quote unquote like surge in active cases right now. And it's like, and I'm sure people in a lot of blue states, especially blue cities, are still having that upswing, even though they're wearing masks. And like one of the reasons is because it does have I'm in favor of them because it seems like in general they're reducing, like, I guess the ability to transmit the disease or to have it transmitted to you. But what I'm also saying is, but don't only talk about masks as if it's the most important thing, because a lot of people who wear them do things that are not hygienic anyways, so it doesn't make a difference for a lot of people. If you rewear disposable masks and put them in your pocket, rub your hand all over the front of them, then the fact that you have a mask over your mouth probably means the same stuff that you're blocking with the mask will eventually get to your face, because you're putting it in your pocket, you're putting your hand on it, and you're touching your face in the next, 5 minutes once you take the mask off. So I'm not saying like, yeah, you shouldn't wear a mask, but I'm saying if you do it ineffectively, then it's not a be-all end-all solution. And all you hear on news and from politicians is wear your mask, as if that's like the most significant thing possible. And it's like, hypothetically, it is arguably, but in practice, I wouldn't say it's going to be the difference between, hundreds of thousands of people dying, most likely. So it's just, I guess what I'm saying is people draw really broad conclusions about masks, even though it seems like based on the available evidence, most people use them very poorly. And I'm saying you should still wear them because wearing them poorly is better than not wearing them. But a lot of people wear them poorly. And that needs to be recognized if you're going to talk about policy, because that's the difference between like why when Joe Biden says there should be a national mask mandate, I'm just like, well, there's a lot of times where people aren't at risk anyways that you'd now mandate a mask. And then people do all these things anyways. So it's like, sure, it's better if people wear masks. I would recommend people wear masks, but I'm not going to act like that's the difference between, being successful and not being successful. And I think when it's been looked at internationally, it's been pretty mixed on the efficacy of masks. So it seems like places where people have historically worn masks are people who wear masks very effectively because it's ingrained in their culture to do things, more effectively with masks because they've already worn them pre-coronavirus just in terms of health precautions. But it makes sense that a lot of Americans would start wearing a mask after never wearing it in public and then not being remotely sanitary with them. So I just think that's probably a factor that people aren't talking about.
I'll just make one quick point, and then we can continue down the list.
Yeah.
I remain unconvinced, I guess, about how should I put this? What you're saying.
I'm just saying it's complex.
I think I disagree. I think I disagree with the way you're interpreting the media's interpretation of masks. Because again, it ultimately boils down to, are they or are they not effective? Now, what I heard you said was you should be wearing masks, but I'm not sure, or I'm that it's probably more effective than not wearing a mask, but I'm not sure.
I'm saying it is more effective than not wearing a mask. I'm agreeing that. I'm agreeing you should wear them, and it's most likely the responsible thing to do on an individual basis. I'd agree with that. I'm just saying there are reasons to be not. I'm not saying skeptical, but I'm saying that there's reasons to say, but you need to say you should probably wear it right, and here's all these ways to wear it right, and nobody's clarifying that, and it's just all about the fact that you're wearing it, not the fact that you're doing 8 other things that go along with wearing it to not undo the effect.
But how does that connect to the earlier point the point you made near the end, where you said the evidence internationally is mixed?
Well, I'm saying the evidence is mixed internationally in the sense that not every country where people are now wearing a ton of masks are like suddenly doing better. But if you looked at places like Japan that were never hit super hard, or maybe I think South Korea, you could arguably attribute their good use of mask wearing to it, as opposed to our poor use of mask wearing. So you could argue that like if we didn't wear masks, we'd be worse off. And I don't know that universe, but that's probably true. But I could imagine the world where all of us didn't wear disposable masks, washed our masks regularly, didn't touch our face after taking our masks off, didn't shove our masks in our pocket, and all these things. And it would probably make it so people were less likely to transmit the disease. So what I'm saying is the fact that we're wearing masks at a high rate doesn't really mean that much, because that doesn't make it comparable to these other countries that might have a history of using them better. And I'm not saying we shouldn't use them because of this. I'm just saying acting like that's the savior is Joe Biden putting on a mask and telling everybody to wear their mask. I'm just saying that might have a relatively small effect compared to other nations that are doing it, because we're not preaching other better etiquettes that might be really important.
Okay, I need I'm still a little confused because okay, let me try. I'll try to say back to you what you said to me, and you correct me or jump in when I begin to stray from what you're saying.
Okay.
Okay. So I hear you saying you're not advocating people do not wear masks. You're not saying, you're not telling the audience members, okay, go, don't wear your mask out in public. You did say that wearing a mask is more effective in terms of preventing coronavirus spread than not wearing a mask. But I guess that this is the part where you lost me a little because so you start talking about, you know, cultural differences. Some cultures might be more used to wearing masks and therefore it might be more effective. And then you said that the number of the number of people wearing masks is, or the number of masks out there isn't necessarily a good factor to judge uh, whether COVID cases will be going down or up or stay the same. Um, yeah, you're gonna have to you're gonna have to walk
Okay.
me through this a little more.
Okay.
I'm really
So
confused as to your position on masks because I feel like
here's
I'm
what I'm
hearing.
criticizing. Here's what I'm criticizing. I'm criticizing when the media shows a person that's wearing a mask and it's like, look at this person. They're doing the correct thing. They're wearing a mask. Because that's not where the story ends. The story doesn't end there. Because you can wear a mask and then you're doing everything else wrong to where I'm not saying it negates fully the effect, but I'm saying it cuts against you a lot. So it's like, yeah, if you're wearing a mask, but it's a disposable mask and it's the 10th time you've worn it, then that mask could very well be covered in COVID particles because of how much you've been outside exposed to different people, I guess, putting their particles into the air or whatnot. So you're wearing this disposable mask. It looks like you're wearing a mask, but you're wearing it for the 10th time. Then you take that mask off with your hand. You just rip it off because you're wearing it and looked like you're doing a good job thing, but you didn't take it off carefully. You took it off with your hand, and then you shove it in your pocket, and then later you take it out of your pocket, you throw it down, and then you're doing stuff, and then you touch your face. And it's like, okay, well, what did you do? It's like, well, you wore a mask, good job, but it's like, but you've also put your hands all over the outside facing part of that mask, essentially rubbed it all over your hands, and then touched your face incidentally because that's what humans do. So what I'm saying is most people aren't used to wearing their masks all the time because why would they in the United States? So all we do, it seems like from the last, last 4 months is kind of glorify the fact that say like Joe Biden wears a mask and like, look at these people wearing masks. And it's like, that's good, but that's where the story ends with them. And it's not talking about how ineffectively most people are probably wearing and using theirs. And it's probably that could be something that if people paid more attention to, might actually be like public knowledge that would be helpful. And it's just like it's just like if you did these other things that put more to it than just wearing the mask, it could probably be more effective. But people aren't really thinking of it other than I just wear a mask and I'm safe, right? I'm mostly safe. I have a mask on, and it's not the other steps behind it.
I'm gonna have to let this one go because I think I'm just interpreting the media's. I'm interpreting the media and politicians very differently, or actually the exact opposite to you in terms of their way they're portraying masks.
Okay.
But I don't know if we want to get
Yeah.
bogged down in that, so we can move on
Because
to another point.
all I see is look at these people not wearing masks, and then it's like, good job, this person's wearing a mask, and none of it is about the proper use of it. It's all and when I'm in public, I see improper use everywhere. So it's like, sure, it's good they're wearing masks. I'll give them credit, but it's like if nobody's wearing it properly, then that's gonna cut against a city or a country, right? It's gonna hurt their numbers because if they're still doing these things that will spread it by still getting the particles all over them, the fact they're wearing a mask, it's like, yeah, that's better than not, but we should acknowledge that a bunch of people are doing it badly. But then I guess the next article, which was really just the main part I wanted to take away from the next one, is masks do really effectively keep you from spreading your, like, if you have coronavirus, the viral load of coronavirus that you're putting out there is reduced a lot by masks. So even if you're doing a bad job of being hygienic for yourself, you're going to be still spraying less out there, even if you're using even if your mask is gross, if you cough and you're wearing a mask, it's still safer for everybody else too. So that's the flip side of it, and that's why other people always say like, "I'm wearing my mask for you" and all that stuff. It is a good reduction of viral load that you're putting out there for other people to get. So I don't know. I feel like, and I listen to like a pretty wide variety of news, but I'm not listening to local news, right? And maybe that's what other people hear more of. It seems to me that it's very binary, the mass coverage, which isn't very fruitful. And you could disagree with that, and that just might be the impressions of the different sources we listen to. Okay. Are we good on mass? Do you want a parting thought before I jump into a couple other things?
I'll just say one quick statement. I just I think the media is emphasizing masks due to their effectiveness. I don't think I don't hear people in the media saying, masks are. I don't hear them. I guess in the way that you're hearing them. I don't think they are necessarily ignoring details or looking at masks as as the only thing related to saving us from the coronavirus. I don't see that. That can just be a disagreement between us.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit more nuance there that I think might make on my side, and there's probably plenty you would make on your side. But I think a little bit is just perceptions of news coverage. Okay, the last two things I'll talk about is a Time article that came out in September. And I think it's pretty relevant when we're talking about the newer increases in cases, because if you look up this Time article, younger Americans are eclipsing older age groups in COVID-19 case counts. You'll find this article, and there's a really pretty chart that's right at the beginning of the article that's titled Monthly Share of COVID-19 Cases by Age. And it's really fascinating because it gives you the January through April column, and then it shows month by month, May, June, July, and August afterwards. And you can see that the amount of people who are in the older age ranges, which I would, I guess, loosely classify as 70 and up, the amount of people who have coronavirus in those groups have been decreasing since January through April significantly. And those are the people who were most at risk for the disease. Now, a lot of people would probably, I think the edgy retort somebody would make in their head if they were listening to me say that would be, well, yeah, because they all died. And I don't think that's actually that true. But I guess I would say, if you look at this type of chart and you have this type of breakdown of ages, even if cases increase, then I don't see the big deal of it, because the people who are most susceptible aren't getting it. So if you look at like all the top three age brackets, which is 60 plus, in August, less than 20% of the coronavirus cases were for people age 60 plus. But back in January, it looks like probably somewhere in like the 28% range, 27% range. And then when you look even more, it looks like only about 30% or so of people who were under 40 made up coronavirus cases. But now that's about half the coronavirus cases are people under 40. And people who are under 40 have like vastly lower mortality rates with coronavirus. So even though we're probably seeing these increases of cases as we reopen, a lot of these increases are attributed to people who aren't at risk getting it, at least relative to older groups that are most at risk. So that's why when I hear these numbers, I kind of like roll my eyes, because I turn on NPR and then they talk about the huge uptick in cases. But then it's like, if you compare it to a few months ago, the groups of people who are getting it more, or who are a larger share of the case pool, are like much safer, right? So the people who are most likely to not really be hit by the disease are the people who are making up a larger percent of the cases. So it's not as big of a deal. It's the people who, if they get it, they likely won't have serious have a serious issue, and they're developing some sort of at least short-term immunity to it, which isn't really a bad thing. Especially when you look at the group that's the group that's 30 and younger, their mortality rate is very, very, very low. And for people who are under 20, their risk of dying from coronavirus is less than people dying from the flu in their age range. So it's really not a huge health risk for them, at least in the short term. Do you have thoughts on that one before I jump into the last one I had in front of me?
I think it just goes back to how we're evaluating the danger of coronavirus. Because one could say we don't know, for example, as you said, I think in an earlier part of the podcast, we don't know the long-term effects of coronavirus. And I'm not a doctor, so I'm not saying this is a fact. I'm just speculating. What if young people or healthy people they don't get sick with it, like or their symptoms aren't that bad, or their case isn't that bad, but it has some impact on them when they're when they turn 60 or 70. It has some long-term effect that might not be noticed right away. So I just wanted to throw that out there. We need to. I think it can be easy to make lazy arguments, and either say use lazy arguments to say that it's extremely dangerous, and lazy arguments to say that it's not dangerous. And there's nuance here, and we need to be careful in the arguments we make when we're talking about when we're talking about coronavirus and the impact that it has on our lives.
Yeah, I actually like that you brought up that point, because I was going to bring this up at the end at the podcast. We didn't end up getting to it one way or another, but I think the lazy argument in favor of lockdowns is probably and in favor of extreme lockdowns is probably the argument I'm most sympathetic to, because it pretty much is lazy because it says we don't know things, therefore we should be as extremely conservative as possible. And this is kind of, to some extent, this was originally, I think this was not Nazim Nicholas Taleb's argument, which I've referenced him before because he wrote like The Black Swan, and he is like a statistician, and he pretty much says if there are huge risks that we aren't aware of coronavirus transmits very highly, therefore all these risks would be like huge tail risks. Because if anybody gets it, it can transmit rapidly, and if it's way worse than we expected, we're screwed because it can grow in on itself, like everybody can get it. So unless we cut it off like how the countries that have 0 cases do, then we should really be scared. And I think that's one of the best cases for any kind of lockdown is we're really, really, really concerned about long-term effects that we can't know. So we will take the utmost precautions. And I think if you're going to weight these long-term outside risks very heavily, then I think that's a valid point. I just don't think most people do, and I don't see much evidence to lean in that direction, because a lot of things that have come out that were kind of flashes in the news was about like how people's lung scans looked after they had coronavirus, and a lot of that stuff was kind of evened out in the months following it, to where a lot of light was shed on that, to where that might not be a legitimate concern. And it's also kind of interesting because that's the same argument that anti-vaxxers make. So if a vaccine does come out for coronavirus, and then people show that it is effective in keeping people from getting coronavirus, the anti-vaxxers, the first thing out of their mouth is going to be, well, you haven't tested this vaccine on people in the long term, and we don't know the long-term side effects of it. So, I mean, it's kind of the same decision that people make when they get vaccines if they're concerned about long-term side effects. It's, do you want to super, hedge this way about there being a potential risk of long-term effects that I can't know about for the time being, so I'll avoid it at all costs? Or will I accept that risk is very unlikely and then act accordingly? I lean on the act accordingly side because I just don't see the evidence that there are long-term risks we should be scared about. Now, if there does end up being one, that's really bad, but we're already kind of past, I think, the point of no return in that, considering how many people have been exposed. If we were going to do something, we should have locked down in like December, the first time anybody had ever heard of coronavirus, and then been very incredibly strict about all sorts of things, and then been almost, I guess, what's the word about it? Almost military styled. I think. I think that's like the argument I'm most sympathetic to. That's not my stance. Yeah, go ahead.
So the idea that we need to be cautious, or we need to be conservative, or we need to err on the side of caution. As the cliche goes, better safe than sorry. I think that is the best way to handle policy, or handle public health policies.
I think that's a trap. I think you just fell into a trap, and I don't say that lightly. And like that's been the excuse for a lot of very bad policies in the United States history about a lot of things, in terms of like why we don't have any privacy from the government. There is a risk that something bad could happen in terms of foreign affairs. Therefore, the government can do X, Y, and Z. And I would say that it's a new disease. So sure, really anything is possible until we fully understand it. But saying we should err on the side of caution, I mean, if we were truly to err on the side of caution, that does mean military-style lockdowns, because we don't want anybody to get this no matter what, unless they absolutely already have gotten it, and then we quarantine them from their families. That's how you minimize the spread, and the government could do that. If they wanted to, and it got public support, they could do that. I just don't see why you would err there. That's like, it's really extreme to err on the side of caution. It's not something to say lightly.
Well, no, I think I need to be. Well, let me need to further my point so we're on the same page. I think what I said means something slightly different to you than what I was trying to say, or what I was meaning to say. And I don't think I fell into a trap in the sense that it's only a trap in the sense that you can cite destructive people. You can cite, supposedly bad people in history who said something about the public good, and therefore we have to do X. But that doesn't necessarily invalidate the idea of doing something for the public good, if that good is actually good, or if that good is a legitimate goal to desire. And I don't. It doesn't bother me to say that, because, as I said, when it comes to health, health is probably the most, or one of the most, if not the most important things in our lives. And so I think we do need to come together as a community in cases like this. I think it worries me somewhat, and I'm not saying you are doing this, but it worries me somewhat, the people out there who are vastly underestimating the potential negative effects of coronavirus. I'm not saying we go into panic mode. I'm not saying it's the end of the world. I'm not even saying that anything the government does will be 100% effective. But I don't think we should play games with the public's health. And I think we do need to be careful. We do need to tread carefully. We do need to think long and hard on the nature of the coronavirus and the possibilities. Just because, like I said, I mean, if you don't have your health, you don't have anything. So I just want to make clear, again, I'm not a doctor, but I do think this is a serious concern. I can have disagreements. I can have disagreements with this policy or that policy, or I can be annoyed that the researchers were a bit inconsistent in the beginning or uncertain about certain things. I don't claim perfect knowledge, and I don't claim that the government has perfect knowledge or that the medical professionals have perfect knowledge. But I do think I am worried. I'm more worried about underestimating the coronavirus than overestimating the coronavirus. If I think I said that right. I'm more worried about not taking it seriously than I am about taking it too seriously. Because I think taking it not serious, I think I think if we don't take it seriously, the cost, the human cost, will be so great. And I think if we take it too seriously, as some people would say, they think we're doing as a society. I'm more content with those trade-offs than I am with other kinds of the trade-off of not taking it seriously at all.
Okay. I'm glad you said that, because I think that's the whole reason why we're doing that episode. Is I think what you just said is conventional wisdom, and I think what I'm laying out is I was trying to systematically poke the holes in that. So I want to revisit a couple points. I'm not going to try to be too argumentative about it, because if I was, there's a few things I'd probably push back on you more on in terms of actual policy. But okay, so the first thing I would say is everything that is in the name of prioritizing limiting coronavirus cases and coronavirus deaths ends up having some sort of human cost, but it might not be direct in an obvious way, which is why we see all these people who are depressed and who are killing themselves. All those people are human lives, and they're dead now. And if we didn't have I'm not saying it's government's response, but I'm saying the government response that has been very blunt and was initially very blunt in March and has created uncertainty for what the government will do in the future, which has only, further made economics and running businesses more confusing. All of that proliferates the, depression that anybody who's on the margin in terms of making money has. And it's also, talking about finances personally is one thing, and that's not the only thing that's causing it. It's social isolation, where people just aren't seeing friends, coworkers, or going to class, and they just didn't have anybody in their life in person. And that took a huge toll, and that was the trade-off, one of the many trade-offs of lockdown policies, right? And people taking coronavirus very seriously because of what the media told them to. And I know people in a lot of red states didn't have those same losses because they weren't taken as seriously. But there are people who are very young and healthy, like me, that are taking it so seriously that they're jeopardizing their mental health. And they probably are more at risk from their mental health now than they ever were from coronavirus, as far as we understand. And I think that is really important to consider, because if somebody kills themselves, then they're dead. But if somebody gets coronavirus and is 20, then the odds of them dying is infinitesimal. And there have been coronaviruses in the past. There have been things that are very similar to the coronavirus in the past. And I would not want to say that I fully understand the coronavirus, but most diseases that are like coronavirus, unless they hospitalize you and do damage to your body in significant, noticeable ways, aren't going to have long-term petering out consequences. So if you get hospitalized, probably did damage to your body, and that could very easily, have long-term impacts. But a lot of young people just are not susceptible to coronavirus in the way elderly people are. And they really are overestimating their risk a lot of the time, even though they're being the ones who are the increase in a lot of these cases. It's still a lot of people, who, especially who are left-leaning, are living in fear, and it's drastically hurting their quality of life. And I'm not just talking 20-year-olds. Pretty much anybody under 40 is not really at risk to be hospitalized or die from it. So it's like, you can't just ignore that consideration. That's like a dramatic impact now. So it's like, when people talk about lockdown policy, it's like, it's not just I can't go to sit down at a fast food place. It's like people are socially isolated, and they aren't necessarily people who can psychologically handle that. And that's just a lot of personality traits. And you could probably argue that's about culture, and that's fine, but it's the reality we live in. And then that's to state that the policy would even work, because then the people who you disagree with that underestimate it would then go and defy the regulation. And then when they defy the regulation, it kind of undermines the work that you intended to do. So it's a double whammy. It's like the people you disagree with end up not following along, so it doesn't work. And the people you do agree with overestimate the risk and then potentially have more personal issues in the moment because they're actually more at risk to mental health ailments. And I don't think that can be just hand waved. That's got to be reconciled.
2 points. And then I don't know if did you have one more point after this, or I don't know how long.
Yeah, there was one other skepticism on, I guess, coronavirus stats I wanted to lay out there that's important.
All right. I'll just say 2 things really quickly. One, I have not in the last couple weeks. I have not seen these articles in the last couple weeks, but it wasn't that long ago that I was seeing articles that said that not only were cases going up among young people, so were hospitalizations. Now, is it true?
What I was saying can both be true. They can both be true.
Is it true?
They can both be true.
I know.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is, young people can go out there and they could underestimate it, and those are the people who will never believe that coronavirus is that serious to them. But the thing is, that's different than the people who are actually at super low risk. Because some people will obviously be hospitalized. It's a really low percentage, but some will be. You still have a risk, right? It's just really low. So if more are going out there and getting it, then they still have a risk, but it's really, really low. Just like when I get in a car, there's a really, really low risk, but there's still a risk that I'll get hurt. So, and especially compared to other people in older age groups. But what I'm saying is, now we've drastically, for the people who are overcompensating, now they're in more danger if you do lockdowns, because then they're afraid that they're going to go out there and die, even though their risk is supremely low compared to most human beings on the planet. And then they're taking all these social costs that are mentally, detractive. And even people who are very mentally healthy have probably posted things on their social media about being more depressed because they don't see their friends. Like, that's affected pretty much everybody, no matter what. And that's not good. That's the point I'm trying to get across. But I know the point you're making. Like, it is increasing, but it's also like, okay, but if you put more fear in them, then they're going to be more afraid to interact at all, and they're going to be more depressed. So it's like a double-edged sword, and the risk of them getting like really sick is like really low.
Let me further my point though. So yes, two things are true. In the sense that someone my age, I'm 21, and you're I think 23, 24. Our age, or even a little older than we are, that age group is less. You are less likely to get it or for it to adversely affect you. This is true, but it, as you say, there is still a risk involved, and even for young people, the risk. The risks, even young people without pre-existing conditions, mind you. So with some of these increase in cases or increase in hospitalizations among young people, it's not just increase of people with asthma that are getting it. It's young people without pre-existing conditions who are young people without pre-existing conditions who are they are now more and more likely to be hospitalized. It might be smaller than some people my grandfather's age. My grandfather's 85. He has, statistically speaking, he would be more likely to be hospitalized due to coronavirus than I would. But we both agree that there's still a risk involved. And the question though is, I suppose, what risks are you willing to accept, or what risks are you willing to deal with, and what risks are you going to mitigate as much as possible? Now, I need to say something really quickly about the whole mental health thing, because I don't want to be misconstrued. The mental health effects of staying at home most of the time and not being able to go out very often, not being able to socialize as much. Those are real. And I don't want to minimize them. I'm not trying to hand wave them or downplay them. it is a difficult time for everyone at some level. If not, health wise, then mentally, it is a difficult time for everyone mentally. But I am not yet convinced. I'm not yet convinced that due to the mental health difficulties while the mental health difficulties. Let me start over. I'm not convinced yet due to the mental health difficulties in quarantine while people are quarantining themselves. I'm not convinced that therefore means that quarantine is bad, or that we shouldn't be quarantining, or that and that's not me saying like I'm hand waving those deaths, but that is me saying it depends on again. I guess I think I might have said this at the very beginning of the podcast, but it really depends on how what we're willing to accept. I guess, in other words, what are we willing? What human cost is too much, and what human cost is just a part of life, I guess, is a good way of phrasing it. And I don't know, but the mental health thing, I mean, I could do a whole podcast by myself on that very topic. I mean, it's just it's a mountain, the mental health stuff. We don't have a good mental health system, period, in this country. So it's not surprising to me that people's mental health is deteriorating in quarantine, when people's mental health isn't very good to begin with in this day and age, and we don't deal with it effectively anyway. And so it seems to me unfair to blame government or countries locking down, it seems unreasonable to say, well, I'm suspicious of lockdown, or I don't think lockdowns are working, or I don't think we should do a lockdown because there's been an increase in suicides. But again, that's not me saying that I want an increase in suicide. That's not me saying that that's a good thing. But we have to think, we have to be very careful here, and we have to decide what, again, to reiterate my point, we have to decide or figure out what human cost is just a part of life, and what human cost is
I have a question.
Much.
How can that be decided? And I ask that meaning, that if we decided something and then enacted a policy, that a bunch of people who just don't agree with it won't follow along. And that's kind of what happened in the last 5 months. So a bunch of people do actively decide through their actions what they're willing to take on and what they're not. So I guess what I'm saying is, haven't we already decided that? In essence, every time a person doesn't care, they have decided. Because I just don't understand how we even get to an answer to your question, because I just don't think that's how it works.
I would say, in response, I would say that at the micro level, I guess, in other words, you're right in the sense that each of us are making these calculations by ourselves. We might be thinking about other people, but we're coming to the consensus to do X, Y, or Z. I came to the consensus that I'm going to wear a mask out in public. I'm sure you did as well. But I am thinking about what we need to decide. And again, this is a big buzzword, but what we decide as a community. We need to come together. This is the thing.
But I'm saying that just doesn't happen. It does, and you come together and people vote, and then you get a president, and then somebody says, okay, in this state our city locks down for 2 weeks, and then all that the data shows on people's anonymized data is then all the people skip town and then they go to the beaches two cities over because they don't agree, and there is no collective decision. It's just not something that can happen. So I just don't think even in practice what you're saying is possible. And that's my big critique of lockdowns. I'm just saying, like, in the United States, they just can't work because people collectively protest them by just going and ignoring them. And it's not like an active, like, oh, we got in a circle and we held signs. It's like, no, they just stop abiding by them. They just go and hang out at their friend's house with 10 people because they decide that. So I just don't understand how in practice that it's even humanly possible. And unless you imposed your mindset on everybody, which we know culturally can't happen in the United States because everybody just kind of doesn't want to take collective action. They kind of just stop following the rules at some point. So I'm saying they can't.
But we're assuming what you appear to be assuming. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I would want to know that the majority. I would want to know statistics on this. Are most people following the rules, or are most people not following the rules? Is it 50-50? That would be important to answer before really we could get further on this question.
Okay, I mean,
because it seems it's I'm under the impression that most people are following the rules most of the time. That doesn't mean there aren't people who aren't following the rules. That they are. There were always people who won't follow rules. But I'm under the impression, partly anecdotal, partly just from reading stuff online and talking to people. Most people are following these rules most of the time, and so therefore that is most of us coming together as a community and saying, okay, we think these. We think this is a good way to live our lives under the circumstances. So that's really all I'm saying.
And fair enough, and I'm sure we'll dig into a lot of where we depart, I guess, probably another time because we're already probably nearing on like 2 hours or something like that into talking about my esoteric criticisms of data analysis in terms of policymaking, which is I guess relatively esoteric. But the last thing I want to talk about was a Reason Magazine article that was titled "What's the Herd Immunity Threshold for the COVID-19 Coronavirus?" And one of the things that this article pretty much talks about is it's somewhat what's the thing that those elitist people always say on policy shows? They're always like, I know this is kind of wonky. It's always really annoying because it's like, oh yeah, you're so smart and cool. You care about the smart and cool things. But this is kind of wonky, I guess, to some extent. So when you're talking about transmission rates of a virus, the variable they use is called R naught. And the R naught in question for COVID-19 is kind of in question. So depending on the researchers you talk to, they estimate it at different levels. And one of the reasons why I like this Reason article is it has a table in it that says approximate herd immunity thresholds for infection elimination. And what the article is all about is it's all about the correlation between how high R naught is and how high herd immunity needs to be to eradicate a disease. And one of the reasons why this is so interesting is because in this table, it lays out a bunch of diseases like mumps, polio, rubella, smallpox, and then H1N1. And it says what their R naught was. And then it shows the herd immunity threshold that's commonly thought of for being the herd immunity needed for that disease to essentially go away. So how many people need to have immunity based on the transmission rate. And they kind of come to the conclusion, because the R naught is undefined, that we really don't know what kind of herd immunity we'd need for coronavirus to go away. It could be anywhere between 10% of people having a lot of immunity to 70%. And this is all because we don't really truly understand the R naught of coronavirus. And part of the reason I just bring this up is because when we talk about, I guess, central plans and containment, it's one of those things that we don't know the variability of how many people actually need to be, say, vaccinated against this, because we don't really understand the true R naught. And a lot of that comes back to how we were talking about PCR testing and what actually should count as a positive test and who's actually positive and who's actually negative. And if we can't even understand basic things like who should really be considered a case and who shouldn't, how could we even begin to understand how transmissible the disease is and then what the real goal should be, which is immunity from the disease. So it's kind of hard to have a game plan if, like, I think we've gone through several articles, but we're talking about so many variables that are undefined that when we talk about aiming a policy towards a goal, it's like so tough to do. And yeah, so I just think that's important to, I guess, recognize whether you're on the side of big government or not. Big government policies, if they estimate certain variables and are wrong, then their policy could be really, really backwards and could indirectly harm a lot of people and not have much positive impact. And then vice versa. And that's the wrap on my statistical skepticism from random articles I picked up over the last 8 months. So do you want to chime in on herd immunity are not transmissibility statistics?
It's hard to know what path to go or what final thoughts I should really say. I mean, I guess this is kind of what comes to my mind. Or maybe I could put it more in the form of a question. So some people, well, I don't know. Let's put it like this: the president likes to compare coronavirus to flu, but one key difference between coronavirus and the flu is the flu has been around far longer than the coronavirus, and we have far more experience with the flu. So, wouldn't you say, or isn't it reasonable at some level to, to tread carefully, so to speak, given the fact that we don't know so much about the coronavirus?
Yeah. So everything I'm saying, so I think I think things are clicking more in terms of how this conversation has gone in ways that were unexpected for me, because I should be framing it. Well, I mean, I should have understood my framing better going in. So I agree with you. I'm saying we should tread carefully because we don't really understand it. But part of why I framed a whole conversation around this is because, to me, the dangers of policies going wrong that people try to implement seems very, very, very dangerous. And the only danger of coronavirus being deadlier than we expect is really if there's a long-term effect that we have not captured yet and don't understand and won't for a decade. To me, that's the biggest concern. But I'm appeased by seeing how low some stats are in terms of like how much treatment's improved over the last several months, and seeing how fewer people, I guess, are dying per rate of the amount of cases and hospitalizations, to where I don't think it's unfair for individuals to make their own decisions and say, it's not too bad for me. Now, comparing it to the flu, like any comparison you make it to is bad for any reason. But like I like comparing it depending on the variable you're talking about, right? So if we're talking about risk on the individual level, I think you should compare it to driving in a car. If I never get in a car, I won't get in a fatal car accident unless the car goes off the street and hits me. Or if I live in my house my whole life, the odds of a car coming in and killing me in a car accident is very low if I never leave my home. But I will usually take on a small amount of risk to go drive, or be driven somewhere. But then people can say, well, that's a terrible comparison, right? Because dying in a car accident is not transmissible to other people. So so you can compare it to things like the flu in narrow ways where it's probably accurate. Like if you talk about mortality for young people, it's pretty comparable to the flu. But we don't know about long-term effects. So obviously, like, we can't assume there's none, but we probably shouldn't assume it's like obscenely bad, especially if you're mostly asymptomatic. So I don't mind the comparison as much as other people do, because I think it's accurate in some dimensions and not in some. Just like I feel the same way about car accidents. I feel like you should compare it to car accidents when I'm talking about if I want to go to the movies or not, for me as an individual. But you probably shouldn't talk about it if you're talking about transmissibility. Okay. Did that answer it?
Maybe one quick follow-up.
Yeah, go for it.
Are you suggesting then that I guess I just want a quick point of clarification about whether the risk of coronavirus is similar to the risk of driving a car or not. I just need to be.
Yeah,
I need that point driven home.
I'm pretty sure if you're under 40, the risk of, like, in terms of mortality for coronavirus is similar to being in a car for your whole life. Like in terms of driving a car your whole life, it's something similar in terms of how minute dying in either way is. If you don't have pre-existing things that push you at risk, like if you're not obese and you don't have like certain types of heart issues that would make breathing difficult, and so forth. Yeah, it's pretty comparable. That's why I think there is a true issue of overstating the risk of it to people who have really no large threat as far as we understand, unless there was a good reason to suspect that there are long-term effects, which up to this point, I don't believe there is any. I mean, I hold out skepticism, it's a possibility, but there's not a lot of evidence that points in that direction.
And is the but is the fact that potentially at least COVID affects can affect more than one person. So given the spread, though, does that alter whether we can compare it to the risk of driving a car?
So that's what I just said. I said it's an apt comparison in terms of things like mortality on the individual level, and it's not an apt comparison in terms of transmissibility, right? That's why I don't mind the flu comparison, because the flu comparison is an apt comparison about some elements, like mortality rates for young people. It's neither of them are very deadly, and then it's a bad comparison when it comes to how transmissible it is, and certain other elements. So I don't really get boggled up in bad comparisons if you're using them in narrow ways. So I don't get mad at Trump for comparing it to the flu that much. I just don't think it really matters.
But what would you say to someone who says that because of the ability of coronavirus to spread, perhaps we should treat the risk differently than the way we treat driving a car? The risk of driving a car.
Well, yeah. So I wouldn't say those should be the same thing, but I would also kind of say this is what we said about, I guess, when you brought up personal responsibility, and I kind of said infectious disease always kind of comes down to what you do. So it's like, sure, if everybody actively has a case of coronavirus, if everybody in the United States but you, had an active case of coronavirus, then if you go to the store, like, yeah, you're probably going to get it, and you didn't really have a choice. But if you're a person, but even in that scenario, if you stayed inside and literally didn't leave your house, nobody would be there to give it to you. Now, we live in a world that is much less intense than the world I just described, where a small amount of people are likely active carriers. And nobody is really compelled to leave their house. You can argue they're compelled to if the only job opportunities they have involve physically going somewhere and they really need the money. And you can argue they should for food, to pick up food, and they have nobody to pick up food for them. Like that is an argument you can make. But in general, I mean, I'm a quick grocery store shopper. I take all the precautions. I'm in and out of there in like 10 or 15 minutes because I know exactly what I'm going to buy, and I'm a whiz through the self-checkout line. So what I'm saying is you can lower your own exposure a lot to the point where it's like, well, do I worry much about 20-year-olds when a 20-year-old has to interact with an 80-year-old to give the 80-year-old coronavirus? And it's like, well, no, I would advise the 80-year-olds not to interact with 20-year-olds that might have it. And I think that's a very simple answer. Okay, so we covered a lot in this one. And the thing I was starting to get at was I spent the episodes painting the idea of skepticism, and my argument is because of skepticism, you can't do big policies because you can't really understand the opportunity cost, right? So whenever you make a policy, there's opportunity cost, and if we don't really know the danger, then you're forcing all these opportunity costs, like by doing these blunt policies on everybody, and you don't really understand what we're even working towards. That's my concern. But it is reasonable for somebody who is not oriented in my thinking to go, oh yes, skepticism means we must ensure that this is minimized until we understand what's going on. And that is the argument for 18-month lockdown. And that's why I'm kind of sympathetic to that argument if lockdowns work better. But I just don't think they're practical, and in practice they work. So that's kind of the thought I was getting at there. And that's why a lot of your criticisms made sense. Because the whole episode I'm talking about skepticism, and you're like, yes, shouldn't we err on the side of government tells you can't do all these things that could be a risk for some people? And I'm sitting here saying, no, that's why skepticism means the government shouldn't stick their hand in it. And it actually makes a lot of sense that we came to opposite conclusions based on the same evidence, if that's kind of what's happening, because those are our priors. So that kind of makes sense. And so I'm not as upset about that once that clicked for me. So, but I do think that's noteworthy to err on here, because a lot of people that listen are probably going to be people who identify more with one of us because we're kind of partisan, and most people are kind of partisan. So as I'm saying things, it'd be very easy for somebody who disagrees with me on the conclusion to agree with what I'm saying and then draw the opposite conclusion. So I just thought that was worthy of note. Since I spent the episode pontificating my beliefs and only giving you moments to flash your stance, if you want to say a minute and a half before I do the shout outs to how they can listen to us and hear more from us, feel free. I know you can't give an exhaustive breakdown of your 20-point policy plan that I know you printed out and you've been working on for the last 3 months. But I will give you enough time to give a minor 90-second. I will mute Trump's mic and let you talk for 90 seconds. And you can go ahead and say your piece, and I won't be an asshole. I'm not supposed to curse on this show. We try not to do that. That's my bad. I'll try not to be a jerk about it, and then we'll sign off.
Okay, so there's just kind of like two meta points that I want to make, and one is a point about like the country like broadly, and then one is a point like about this conversation we're having. So just a quick point about like the country as a whole amid the pandemic. I'm a little concerned. I think that's the right word. I'm a little concerned about how partisan, how political coronavirus has become. And I don't want to get. I'm not trying to veer into the territory of like certain liberals like bemoaning the like, oh, we used to care about the truth and now we don't care about the truth anymore. I'm not trying to say that. I'm not making a cheap point like that. But it does worry me that it does seem to me that one's view of coronavirus has far more to do with politics than it actually does with the facts on the ground. And I think that is particularly worrying given the potential human cost either of shutting down or not shutting down. And so then the meta point about this conversation, I guess I want to explain a little bit about my thought process. I explained a little at the beginning, but explain just a little more just for further context, and then you can wrap up. In my thought process, I was trying to keep my own opinions to a minimum. But there were a couple times when I thought that in order to play the devil's advocate properly, I should give like actual examples of maybe my thought process or just the thought process of the average person or the thought process that the mainstream media is putting forth. So I hope that didn't derail the conversation too much, but it seemed the best way to, for me at least, to understand where you're coming from. I hope I did my job in the sense that anyone listening to this, besides you and I, was also able to understand your perspective through some of my questions and my criticisms and whatnot. Like I said, we'll probably be doing a follow-up episode. Give me one moment. Sorry, that was Ted talking to someone. Oh yeah, okay. I think I remember what I was going to say. Okay, sorry. Okay, I'll wait a second, and then I'm gonna have to do a lot of editing. But anyway, we'll probably do a follow-up episode in the near future, in which I am the one pontificating, and I'm the one laying out my case in a far better way than I did during this episode. And then Matt will be the devil's advocate in that situation and ask me questions and give me comments. Because and I think this is important. I'll say one more quick thing. I think it's important to talk about the coronavirus because of how politicized it is. And if we want to come to, if you'll forgive the phrase, the truth about the matter, we really have to, we really have to analyze not only what we think, but what everyone else thinks. And then we have to look at the evidence and use our critical thinking skills in order to come to some semblance of the truth, some semblance of a reasonable conclusion. And so I'm glad that you proposed that we talk about this, and I'm glad we talked about it, and I'm glad we'll talk about it in the near future. So I hope anyone out there listening, I hope you got something out of it. I know I did.
Yeah, and if you guys weren't persuaded, at least I hope I brought a lot of things to your attention that were at least, I guess, worthy of knowing, because they are concerning, like the PCR, stuff like that, where it's like all these ways that testing happens is really in the air, and it might not even be smart. And we take all these things for granted when we hear them on the news or stuff like that. And that's pretty concerning if you care about having an answer that's based in anything other than partisanship. So I guess I'll leave that there. So hopefully you gain something from this podcast. If you want to listen to more episodes, feel free to check out our back catalog. You can find it on any of the podcatchers or on YouTube by searching The Anti-Philosopher and Beyond Talking Points. I'm sure the next one we do about coronavirus will be very, very argumentative, because I think I realized that when you were pushing back, it just made me want to go down the rabbit hole of things. But I think that just might be like the error of the thing I'm arguing for is really, was arguing for the absence of government, which kind of meant if you brought up government points, I'd have to explain why they were bad. So it wasn't something I could like really touch on without going down a rabbit hole. So I think we might go into a lot of rabbit holes on the next one we do on COVID. But I hope you walked away at least feeling to some degree more informed. So yeah. It's always a great chatting with you, Matt, and signing off, Matt.